Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello everyone. Before we begin this week's episode, just a special dedication to someone who was a really important person on the battlefields. That's Jackie Plateau from the Last Post Association at the Menin Gate, and sadly he died last week after a lifetime of service to that memorial and to the people recorded on it. So anyone who's been to the Last Post service at the Menin Gate, one of the most important services on the Western Front, would have seen Jackie. He was always busy. He was always at the front. He often read the ode, and he was always busy organising wreaths for school children and basically ran the whole show there. And he really did a lot of great work in conserving that service and making sure that service continued even during COVID. And so he was a good mate and someone that most Australians got to know when they went to that service at the Menin Gate, and a sad loss to the town of Ypres. So this episode of the podcast is dedicated to Jackie and his wonderful work at the Menin Gate.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of BattleWalks as we walk across the great battlefields of Europe. I hope you're enjoying listening to what we're doing, because we are certainly enjoying doing it. It's been a wonderful journey over the past several months. We've now had tens of thousands of downloads. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. It's just been gratifying and fantastic to share in this experience with you. When we started doing this, we had no idea how people would respond, and it's just been great that everyone's on board and enjoying what we're doing. And part of the reason is no doubt my co-host, who does a wonderful job every week. It's Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back.
Hey, Matt. Good to be with you again.
Looking forward to this one, mate. Back to Belgium, which I know is a popular spot for you and I. It's a popular spot for visitors we take on tours, and there's no more important site, along with the Menin Gate at Ypres. There's no more important site than the one we're doing today. It's Tyne Cot Cemetery. Now, this is the destination that everyone visits. I don't have statistics on this, but it must be the most visited site on the Western Front, I would imagine. I mean, even coaches that are not doing a battlefield tour, that are just on their way through the area, tend to stop at Tyne Cot. It is huge. It's the world's largest Commonwealth military cemetery. It's huge. It's on a vitally important part of the Passchendaele battlefield, one of the most famous battlefields of the First War. Just an amazing site all round. What's your relationship like with Tyne Cot Cemetery, Pete?
That's a very good question because it's mixed. In the sense that I like it when there's very few people there, but because of the reason it is so popular, it can get unbelievably busy. And in that period of the centenaries, then you'd sometimes drive up and there'd be 20 or 30 coaches there. And you're thinking, oh my Lord, that is just so many people in. And it did occasionally feel like you were with a football crowd. Now it's great that so many people want to go and visit the men that fought and died in the Great War, but it's just an awful lot of people to cram into. It is a big cemetery, but an awful lot of people to be in there. So I prefer to go early in the morning or late in the evening as the sun's rising or falling, and it's just spectacular when you're there with just a very small group, or even if you've managed to get there by yourself. Then you really get a good feel of the whole site and the feel of how many graves there are. If you can't see them because there are so many people in there, then it makes it just slightly difficult. But it's a stunning place to stand there. Horrific, yes, I suppose, because these are soldiers that fought and died in the Great War. But it's such a magnificent memorial, you'd have to say, to them.
It's fascinating the number of people that are now going to these sites. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. For years and years, there was a time when people weren't bothering to turn up at all. You hear people talk about in the 1960s going to the last post service at Menin Gate and being the only person standing there, that the number of buglers outnumbered the number of people in the crowd. So obviously those days are far behind us. Hopefully it's sustainable. Hopefully people will continue to do it, and hopefully they'll do it for the right reasons. I don't get the impression that people are just ticking off an item on a list of sites to stop at. There does seem to be genuine interest and genuine connection from the thousands and thousands of people that go there every year.
Yeah, I think I have to disagree slightly. I think slightly Tyne Cot is for some people a tick on the box, and certainly for the cruise liners that are coming into Belgium, where they just get a choice of visits. Then sometimes I've heard people literally walk through the gate there and go, "Wow, that's fantastic!" And you're looking and think, that's kind of an odd thing to say, really. But I know why they're saying it. It's because they're being taken to these wow, fantastic sites for the whole of the cruises that they're on, and so they just automatically say it. But it is a strange reaction as you walk into a cemetery and wow, look at that.
Well, why don't we start? Why don't you give us a bit of a description of the cemetery, because this is like no other cemetery in the world. Why don't we talk about let's have an overview of just what it is, why it's there, the reasons that Tyne Cot exists in the form that it does.
Well, I think what we'll start with is the name itself, Tyne Cot. Now, over the years, I've heard lots of variations of why it's called Tyne Cot, and I think everybody, or most people now fairly much agree that the Tyne part of it is a river in the north of England, and there was various areas up on these ridges were being depicted by the map, the people that were drawing up the maps and saying, well, we'll call this area Tyne, we'll call this area another river, we'll call this the Seine, we'll call this the Marne. So that's where the name Tyne comes from. It's a river. And then Cot is an abbreviation of cottage. So it was Tyne Cottage, and it was probably a small grouping of farm buildings. It could even have been the German blockhouses that from afar looked like a small grouping of buildings. So I think that's the reason it got the name Tyne Cot. There's a story that it was Northumberland Fusiliers who were in the area, and they were the people that named it. But actually, we know that it was already named as Tyne Cot prior to even to them arriving. So I think it's just a name that was picked by the people that were drawing the maps. And so it's a battlefield name that then is going to be used, since they're going to build a cemetery there, they're going to then call it Tyne Cot as well. So that's how it's got its name.
It's an interesting thing, the naming of all these places from the First World War. I find it fascinating because some of the most famous sites on the Western Front have earned their names for no reason at all, except it was an arbitrary name on a map. And Tyne Cot's a perfect example of that. It doesn't actually mean anything today. It's been effectively lost in the mists of time why it was called that. But the point is, the people that named it probably didn't care that much. What you note when you look at these maps is there's so many features that need to be named. It does feel almost a little bit like fatigue in the system of naming them at some stage. We've got to call it something so soldiers know where to go when they receive orders. And they're just, they're saying, okay, we're going to name them after streets of London. We're going to name them after, locations in the southwest of England. We're going to name them after, small towns in the outback of Australia. Whatever generic system they use. And one that I know as well, in not very far from Tyne Cot, is there used to be a very famous pillbox called the Anzac pillbox. And everyone was like, oh, that was named, must be because Australians or New Zealanders captured it and they wanted to honour their comrades and et cetera, et cetera. But you look on a map and you note that the pillbox next to it was called Helles and the pillbox next to that was called Suvla. So obviously the person who drew the map had served at Gallipoli and simply named the pillboxes after the sectors of Gallipoli that they recalled. So it's a fascinating aspect, and hopefully someone will do some more work into it one day about the arbitrary naming of these now famous sites.
I think they also used those kind of one that's close to me here is drinks. It's alcoholic drinks, and it's word association for men that are tired and are trying to figure out, trying to remember where these areas are that they're supposed to be assaulting, or in fact even leaving from or heading to. Then do a bit of word association. It helps you remember what the names were. So I think that's also used.
And often the letter of the trench square that they're in as well. So trenches and features in the maps were divided up by alphabetic letters, and often you'll find in a square that if it's an M, for example, in the M square, they'll all be called Malt Trench, Maple Trench. They'll have variations on M names so that if you hear a name of a trench or a feature, instantly which square it's going to be in. So again, a fascinating chapter. We could get way too bogged down delving into it in this podcast, but I'd love some more research to be done on it at some stage.
I thought you were going to drift on then to how you look at map references of the First World War.
Let's do map references. Or
another podcast, I think.
I think we should do that on the podcast one day. We should suck in the dear listener with a famous destination, then bog them down with how to read a trench map. That would be a fascinating exercise. But no, that's true. Tyne Cot is one of those great mysteries, and people argue about the name, and I'm sure they will for time immemorial. Let's talk about the size of this cemetery, Pete, because that's one of the key. That is the key feature of this cemetery.
It is. So it is the biggest Commonwealth War Graves cemetery in the world. And before we go into the figures, you have to say, well, why is that? Why do we need this enormous cemetery? Well, it's as simple as this. So many of the burials were individual burials in this area that there needed to be a big cemetery to gather them all in. There were very few actual small cemeteries built. There are going to be a number. They are also going to be closed down and brought into this enormous cemetery. But it was felt that what they needed was a big concentration cemetery to bring in the dead that were being found in the clearances and also removed from marked graves. You have to say, so many people became missing in this area that almost anywhere you dug your spade as you're levelling the ground, as you're building your farms, then you, as horrific as it may sound, you are very likely to find the remains of the soldiers that fought there. So they needed to be somewhere where they could be brought, and that's why we get this cemetery created. Now, interestingly, it's created around an original burial ground. So there is a small burial ground that was started during the fighting in 1917, containing 343 graves, and those graves were tucked in just behind a pillbox. And that pillbox was used as a medical aid post at that period. So these are soldiers that are either dying in the medical aid post or being brought in just from the surrounding areas. Now, it was still very dangerous at that time. The Germans are just over the ridge. They're not that far away. And so even then, these 343 were brought in with difficulty. And sadly, we're going to lose that land because in 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, we will actually lose it. 13th of April is when we lost the land again. And the Germans actually buried some of their own dead in the same area. And then eventually it's retaken by the Belgian army on the 28th of September. This 1918, this little cemetery is still there, and this becomes the core of an expansion that will take it to the extraordinary numbers that we have now. So it's nearly 12,000 soldiers are buried here. The actual figure is 11,961. Now, you have to keep an eye on that figure because this is still an open cemetery. They will still bury soldiers within the complex here, or the graves here. So 11,961 at present, I believe, of them. And this is the figure that always shocks everybody. So let's say 12,000 buried, and 8,500 of those, again, rounding it up slightly, are unknown, so we don't know who they are. So they have no name on the headstone, and that is just extraordinary, isn't it? 12,000 and 8,500 unknown, we don't know who they are. And that gives you an indication of the horrific task faced by the people exhuming these bodies in trying to identify them as they brought them into this cemetery. And sadly, the greater number of them are not going to be identified.
Pete, there's a few really important things I want to focus on there in that excellent description. Thank you for that. But firstly, I want to say that a couple of years ago, you and I did a podcast on my Living History channel about cemeteries and how they were formed and the people that recovered the bodies. So it's a fascinating topic. And I know you and I are absolutely fascinated with the recovery of bodies, as gruesome as it is. It's a vital part of the story because the cemeteries we now see today are the results of that hard work done by people in the early 1920s. So firstly, go back, find Living History on your favourite podcast app and go and listen to that. It's just called World War I Cemeteries with Pete Smith, and an excellent discussion from Pete about how these cemeteries were formed. But let's talk about the nature of the fighting in 1917. We are going to begin a tour of the cemetery very soon, but let's just talk about the nature of the fighting in 1917 because it was quite specific. There's quite specific reasons that in this part of Belgium there are these huge concentration cemeteries as opposed to the smaller battlefield cemeteries you would see in somewhere like the Somme or the Arras sector. Let's talk about the nature of the fighting here in 1917 and why it directly leads to these huge cemeteries with huge numbers of unknowns.
Well, the simple nature, the landscape itself is horrific. It's because it's low-lying land in the main. Obviously, this is actually built on the slope of a ridge. A little bit more about that later, but it's on the slope of a ridge. But it's low-lying land, it's heavy clay, it gets waterlogged, it's horrendous. And it had been drained over centuries. It had been drained by a network of clay pipes just below the surface, which kept the water down. That's all gone, smashed to pieces by the bombardments. And so this has really turned into a quagmire. Also, most of the area, until we clear these ridges in 1917, we are overlooked by the Germans. And that means, obviously, you're not going to lose the living to bury the dead. And so the burial of and creation of cemeteries was exceedingly difficult. And it meant that the majority of men that were killed in this morass were just rolled into the nearest shell hole, covered over as best they could, rifle with a helmet on top. If you're lucky, somebody will later on come along with a more substantial cross and try and mark your grave. But the big issue is this is constantly being turned over. This is being shelled all the time. There is a toing and froing, and it means that the bodies were lost over and over again, and sometimes horrifically reinterred and then buried again. And yeah, it was just a nightmare landscape. And of course, the period that we're talking about here, it's now known as the Battle of Passchendaele. The overall campaign is Third Ypres. Passchendaele's the last phase of it, and this is just prior to that last phase. This is the 4th of October we're going to be discussing in 1917. The weather is just about to get worse. The weather is just about to change, and it's going to start raining incessantly, which just, you can imagine what it's going to be like. It's just purely horrific. There's no shelter. You've got your waterproof cape. If you can get under that, that's the best you can hope for. So the recovery, burial, or the burial of bodies, the movement of bodies during the campaign is almost impossible. And it really will be till the end of the war, because the Germans are going to be eventually just forced over the ridge. They're not that far away. We get a limited clearance. Then the Germans come back and recapture the landscape. They're not interested in clearing it. So we really have to wait until the end of the war before we can get to grips with the proper burial of the men that fought and died on these ridges.
The way you describe that, Pete, it's just ghastly. The idea of people rolling shattered bodies into shell holes and covering them with the nearest mud that they could lay their hands on and just marking it with a rifle and bayonet. Those graves are going to be lost within a matter of days, let alone years. I mean, the bloke that you buried last week, it has no chance that he is still there or his grave can be found or he can be identified, a few days later, let alone years after the war, let alone years later. So that's why we just see such a huge number of unknowns.
And there's a big problem going on here as well, compounded sadly by the new identity disc that had been issued in I think they start to be issued in 1916, and these could even be possibly late 1915. Not quite so sure on that, but the new 2-part identity disc, which they go, that's good. One part will go with the burials office, and the other one will remain on your remains. It's a fibrous material, actually designed not to burn, so it's actually a compound material including asbestos, oddly, and And that doesn't like being in the ground in waterlogged conditions for a long time, and it swells and it will eventually disintegrate. So the issue you have is if a body is going to be in the ground for over a year before it can be recovered, then the likelihood of finding those that identity still on the remains is unlikely. The other thing you have to remember is that these human remains only a year old, and not just bones. These would be horrifically flesh as well. And are you going to start trying to find the identity discs? Well, soldiers actually even tried to help with that process. They knew that the cord could rot through, it could get damaged. So they would actually place their identity disc in their top left-hand pocket rather than keep it on a string around their neck. It meant that everybody knew where it would be. Well, sadly, even that's not going to work particularly well because the uniform will be rotting. Horrifically, the disc could even drop through into the body cavity. And people just don't want to fish about that much trying to find it. So I've actually seen soldiers in my photo collection I have of the Great War of portraits of soldiers. I've actually got a couple of photos where the soldiers have gone one better. They've actually stitched the identity disc onto the outside of the pocket. So it's already stitched there. And I think that in its own right is horrific. Now, these guys are preempting their own deaths and preparing for their own deaths by fastening their identity discs onto their uniforms. But anyway, that was one of the things they tried, but still to no avail, because after over a year, these discs start to fall to pieces. You won't easily find them. It's a great shame. If they kept the metal ones, which they had prior to in the Gallipoli campaign, they had metal identity discs. They were made out of aluminium, but the issue with aluminium identity discs is that they melt, and because they had fires across some of the areas on the peninsula, and the bodies actually caught fire and the discs melted, so they went to this asbestos-based disc, which was a great idea, but sadly didn't work for being buried in the ground.
What a feature of the war that we don't discuss very often, but the confrontation of your own death, the nature of the soldiers, and their own mortality, and soldiers doing things like constructing their own identity discs out of metal, which they'd often wear around their wrist. You see photos sometimes of soldiers with a metal plate around their wrist with their details on it. Just imagine what that does to a human, noting that, just not wanting to disappear into the ground forever, wanting to, even during the war. I mean, we know now about the huge numbers of missing, but obviously it was a factor during the war, and soldiers,
they knew it,
going out of their way to try and avoid that fate for themselves. I mean, what a way to live your life. Just absolutely horrific. What we should say about Tyne Cot, Pete, is it's not just a cemetery, it's also a battlefield in its own right. So let's talk about the fighting in October 1917 in particular. And leading up to that, and why the cemetery is where it is, and the nature of it as a battlefield.
Yeah, so of course, it's interesting when we look at the cemetery now. There is at first glance no obvious relics of the battlefield left there, but the biggest relic is where the Cross of Sacrifice. Every Commonwealth War Grave cemetery, as we know, has a Cross of Sacrifice, and beneath that Cross of Sacrifice, we actually have a very large blockhouse, covered over by the Jurassic limestone now, apart from one small patch where we have a bronze wreath, and we can then, in the centre of the wreath, we can actually see part of the blockhouse itself. But when you look more carefully to the other end, and I have to say, we have entered, so we've just walked into the cemetery, and we are walking in from the back. It's now where the car parking is. You can walk right the way to the front, but actually I like coming in from the back because you've got the wall behind you, which is going to carry the names of the missing, another aspect of this cemetery that we'll talk about. But you get that immediate view across the whole gambit of the cemetery, really. The graves, the Cross of Sacrifice, the Stone of Remembrance, which every large cemetery will have. And then right at the other end of the cemetery, we can see two prominent German blockhouses that have nothing on them. They are just there as part of the concept, the design of the cemetery. And so it tells you immediately that we are not just in a cemetery, we are on the battlefield. And the way that we get an absolute confirmation of that is if we walk to the front, to the other side of the blockhouse, then we can see the words inscribed on it. This was the Tyne Cot blockhouse, captured by the 3rd Australian Division, 4th of October 1917. So it tells us straight away that we are actually standing on the on the middle of a battlefield. And I have to say, in the years that I've been going there, you're looking among the graves, you're looking at the graves, I've looked down and I've actually picked up shrapnel balls, lead shrapnel balls within the confines, the walls of the cemetery.
So it's an extraordinary fact that this is not just a cemetery, but also a battlefield, and an important Australian battlefield. It's the Battle of Broodseed Ridge from October 1917. I mean, it's a spectacular story of how the Australians captured that area. The field in front of the cemetery across the road was the scene of some of the most horrific attacks that the Australians made through that area, and gaps in the barbed wire and German machine guns pouring from this spot on top of the ridge. And there were dozens of blockhouses just like the two at the front of the cemetery on top of this ridge. And just incredible stories of bravery. The farm across the road from Tyne Cot as well is Hamburg Farm. And there's another couple of blockhouses there which were captured by Lewis McGee from Tasmania. He captured those with a revolver during the Battle of Broodseed Ridge. It's just extraordinary acts of heroism on the ground where you are standing. It's an important central point in that fighting of Third Ypres. I mean, everywhere in the Ypres salient there was fighting, but to stand on this point, you are standing right in the middle of some of the toughest actions, which, from both the Battle of Broodseed Ridge in early October and then, of course, leading into the Battle of Passchendaele.
So interestingly, Sergeant Lewis McGee, who you just mentioned, is buried here within the complex of the cemetery, which thankfully he's got a grave, which is a good thing. We can actually go and visit him. We can see where he was awarded the Victoria Cross, and sadly he was killed a few days later on the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele on the 12th of October. So in attempting to do a very similar act to the one that had caused him to be awarded the Victoria Cross. So very sad, but again, I think people who do these acts are aware of the difficulty and of what they're doing, but very much they just want to get this over with, and they want to try and preserve the lives of their men. And as a sergeant, that's exactly what he was trying to do, and sadly will lose his life. So he's buried here.
Well, let's begin the tour, Pete. As you said, we've come in the back, and we're standing at the back of the cemetery. So as we've just come through, just describe what we're now looking at, and particularly that memorial that you touched on before, the memorial wall behind us.
Yeah. So we're looking, first of all, as we walk through and into the cemetery itself, we're looking at the back of the wall, and the back of the wall is beautifully napped flint. So it's flint, a stone from England, and found on the Somme, everywhere on the Somme. It's found wherever chalk can be found. And this napped flint is pressed into the wall. So we have a beautiful back of the wall. The front of it is covered in Jurassic limestone, and it's only when you step a little bit away and turn around to look back at the entrance you've just walked through, you realise all of these names. And these are the names of the missing. Nearly 35,000 names. It's just mind-boggling. You have to kind of walk further and further back and keep looking at the wall to realise how many people that there are on there. So what is that all about? Well, these are the missing from this area, because in the August of 1917, the names move from the Menin Gate, and that's where anybody that died in the area of the salient for the British. For Australians, they're all down there. All the Australians are down there, as are all the Canadians. But for the British, there are just too many. And it was decided that they would be moved up onto this wall at Tyne Cot Cemetery. And so we have this extraordinary number of missing soldiers, 35,000. Of course, some of that 35,000 are here. They are part of the 8,500 men who are unknown here. So if you go and look at a headstone that says the badge of the Manchester Regiment, but a soldier known to God, then he is on that wall. If you look at the Manchester section, and because it's regimentally by regiments, look at the Manchester Regiment, and he will be on that wall somewhere. So it's nice in that way. You know, their names are close to the men themselves, but it is just mind-boggling. The archway that we come through, this little area that we come through, is a little asp. I think that's a technical term for it, a little asp there, and that's where the New Zealanders are. So the New Zealanders are on this wall as well. I said it's the British, but the central section there, this central asp, there are New Zealanders commemorated there as well, because they are always commemorated close to their battlefield, and they fought on the Gravenstaffel Ridge, which is on our right. If we're looking into the cemetery from this back wall, it's on our right-hand side, and that's where we get the New Zealanders fighting here during the Battle of Passchendaele, and their missing are commemorated here. Now, there's always a name there. I'm just going to talk about it quickly because it just catches my eye all the time. And there's a padre. There's a New Zealand padre, chaplain, who is commemorating there. And I often think, how on earth does a chaplain become missing in this battle? And of course, it's because he's right up close by the front. He was in one of the blockhouses, and he'd actually just stepped outside. His name is Captain Guy Spencer Bryan Brown. And he was administering to the wounded, helping the wounded, giving, no doubt, talking to the wounded, perhaps giving them water, giving them the last rites, even though he was actually a Church of England chaplain. But he stepped outside to get some air, and as he stepped outside, a shell landed beside him, and he was killed. And he was buried by the blockhouse, but his body couldn't be found at the end of the war. So he's commemorated to the missing. And I always point him out because it's just unusual to see a chaplain in the list of the missing.
It's quite remarkable, Pete, the nature of Tyne Cot. I mean, I've said this so many times, so actually my apologies to everyone who's heard this, but I talk about this all the time. The scale of death in the First World War is something we can't get our head around. The combination of this wall with 35,000 names, and noting there's another 54,000 on the Menin Gate, and then 12,000 headstones, which is more than the human mind can comprehend when you take them all in. It's just, there's no other place on the battlefields where you can just at least get a sense of what a big battle meant and a big series of battles meant, and the sacrifice and the loss and the devastated families. It's just overwhelming, isn't it?
Well, it's also very, very clever because the landscape that we can see, because we are on the slopes of a ridge in a very flat landscape. This is the slope that will take us up onto the top of the Passchendaele Ridge. And from here, you get a great view. We can see the spires of Ypres. We can see all the way. And you realise that the landscape, that landscape of hell, of desolation, is from where we are standing all the way to perhaps where we came from in the morning or where we're going to be heading to in the afternoon, to Ypres itself. So it's just extraordinary to have that vista of the landscape, to be able to see it. And you start to really understand about why these guys are in here, why so many people are in here, because they're going to be killed in that landscape that was a landscape that was nothing but other than hell that is all around us. So it's an extraordinary place to be, and because of those preserved blockhouses, we get that extra feeling, that extra feeling of, well, here we are actually standing on the battlefield.
So leaving the wall, Pete, and walking further into the cemetery, what's our next destination?
Well, the interesting part here is in the old days, as we left the wall and started walking, we started to walk in a quagmire. Because in the period when more and more people were arriving here, it's lawned. You immediately stepped onto lawn, and that was what was envisaged by the architects, that there would be a connection with the land here by walking on the lawns. But it was starting to get silly, so they've in the last 5 years, perhaps even 6 years now, they've paved them. So we're walking on a Jurassic limestone pavement, and that's fantastic because we now don't have to squelch slightly, and it means that the lawns can stay in their normal pristine condition. So we're onto this Jurassic limestone pavers, which will take us up to the Stone of Remembrance. This altar, I suppose it was designed to look like an altar. And we can stand in front of this altar, and we're looking directly then from the altar to the cross of sacrifice. And in between that altar and the cross of sacrifice is the Stone of Remembrance, the cross of sacrifice. That is where we have the little original battlefield cemetery. So this small grouping of men that were buried here around the blockhouse, when the blockhouse was purely a blockhouse. So that's, again, we get these various aspects, this great concentration cemetery in all directions, then this small battlefield cemetery, cross of sacrifice, the blockhouses, the wall behind us with all the names of the missing. So there's so much to talk about, and you can literally, I always get lost in here, you can stay in here for 2 hours and still not finish talking, and that's without actually walking in amongst the graves and perhaps pointing out a soldier here and a soldier there. There is just so much to talk about in amongst all of this, all of the graves and the walls and the blockhouses and the views that we get.
I always find it a fascinating place, that original little part of the cemetery. You can spot it instantly because all the graves are laid out in such a higgledy-piggledy nature compared to the nice, neat, straight rows of the concentration cemetery. So it's instantly identifiable that this was a cemetery built during the war, because they just, the hurried nature, the rushed nature of burying these soldiers just wherever there was a convenient spot. And it tells such an interesting little story. There's a number of graves that are together, communal graves where a number of bodies have been put in the graves together. So the headstones are marked with co-joined badges of various units. There's a couple of graves that say just 4 unknown soldiers of the Great War, or 6 unknown soldiers, so showing that a whole bunch of unknown men were thrown in there together and just marked. A couple of Germans in there, a couple of unknown Germans, but a couple of Germans who were killed on the 4th of October 1917. So you would assume defenders of this pillbox, who, when the Australians came through, cleared the area, they just simply chucked these dead Germans, they just killed into the nearest shell hole and carried on. So even the little cemetery itself around the cross of sacrifice tells some just fascinating little stories.
Yeah, it does. And then, of course, if you want that extra view, then you can actually, and this is seen by some people as not a good thing to do, but it was designed to do this. I always explain to people that, you can walk up steps onto the cross of sacrifice, and you can sit there on the cross of sacrifice and look down on the graves or look across the landscape and contemplate. Now, we do get people nowadays who don't like it. They seem to think that people are climbing and it's sacrilegious. They shouldn't be climbing on the cross of sacrifice. But it was designed to do that. Now, it wasn't designed for kids to run round and round it, which occasionally you do see as well. But it was designed for you to go up there, to sit on the stone there. It's literally designed to be a seat and to look at the battlefield. And yet we do get some people who don't like it nowadays. What do you think about it, Matt? Do you like it?
It's a great question. We've touched on this before, and I've touched on it in other podcasts. When I did a walk around Passchendaele for Living History, I talked about it as well. I think we can be a bit too precious about these things. It's wonderful the amount of respect people show to these cemeteries and to these hallowed sites, and they absolutely should, and it's absolutely wonderful. But we don't want to get too precious about it. We don't want to start undoing the good work that the designers and the veterans and the pilgrims intended for the cemeteries. And that's a perfect example. When they built this, they built it so that people could climb up on the cross of sacrifice, and for that reason, that they could look out across this entire cemetery and indeed the entire battlefield, and it would give people a perspective of how much ground was fought over, of the sacrifice that the men who are lying here made to capture this ground. So it's an absolutely original intention of the cemetery, and I don't think there's anything wrong with us fulfilling the ambitions of the cemetery designers to do that. And thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of family members of missing soldiers, hundreds of thousands of veterans have made that same climb. And I don't feel that we're not worthy to follow in their footsteps. I feel we're continuing the journey that they began, as long as you're doing it respectfully. It's the same thing as we said, you've mentioned this before, Pete, but the idea of maybe having a cup of coffee and a sandwich in a cemetery, people would look at that, oh, that's outrageous, you can't eat within a cemetery. But again, that's why these cemeteries were designed. Many of them have little benches and little, not quite picnic areas, but little poor weather areas where you could sit to keep out of the rain and have a flask of coffee and a sandwich. Again, because pilgrims were coming to spend, and they would spend time here. If a family came and found their son buried in a cemetery, they weren't just going to go to tap the grave and wander off after a few minutes. They were going to stay for hours. And so they needed places to get out of the rain. They needed somewhere they could sit and have a sandwich and a rejuvenating cup of coffee. And these features are still built into these cemeteries. And I'm of the beliefs. I know that some people think, well, we're not worthy. We didn't fight there. We didn't lose a son. We're not worthy of participating in the same way that those people did. I disagree. We are doing a wonderful thing by making a pilgrimage of our own to the battlefields to pay our respects. And I think we should use the cemeteries originally as they were intended.
I did it only last week. I went to a little cemetery called Sunken Road Cemetery, quite close to Poitiers, and it was just starting to rain. We had a flask of coffee with us, and I remembered that in this cemetery there is a little shelter. Literally, it's a very narrow shelter. It's tucked in. It's got a bench at the end of it, and we dived into there. The wind was howling. The rain came pouring down. We got the flask out, and we had a biscuit each, and we sat there and drank a coffee and waited for it to blow over. And that's exactly what they were designed for. So absolutely nothing wrong in having a coffee and a biscuit or a sandwich in these little shelters. I have to say, perhaps Tyne Cot, because it is so open, not ideal. And even by the design, it kind of gives you a clue, really. This is more of yes, you could have a flask of coffee, but it doesn't feel a place where you could stand. There's no little shelters. It's very much a place where you contemplate. Now, I was going to bring something in here. Of course, there is somebody else that climbed on top of this blockhouse before the cross of sacrifice was put on top of it, and that was the king. The king in 1922 came on a pilgrimage to the Western Front, and this was a place he really wanted to go to. Now, you have to say it's interesting because nearly everywhere else he went to, the cemeteries were complete. They had their headstones in, the new headstones, not the crosses, not the wooden crosses any longer. We see headstones now, but that isn't what they were built originally with. They had crosses. When he came to Tyne Cot, it was still crosses everywhere. But he still wanted to come, even though it wasn't completed, by no means completed. The cross of sacrifice wasn't on top of the pillbox. I mean, there is a story that it was the king himself that suggested that the cross of sacrifice should be built on top of the pillbox. It's definitely not the case, because the layout was done, the design was finished. That is how it was going to look. The cross of sacrifice was definitely already going to go on top of the pillbox. But there we can see the photo of the king standing on top of the pillbox, looking out onto the graves all around him, but they are still wooden crosses. And I like that imagery that the king made the effort. He was very keen, and in fact the book he produced, which I have a copy of on my bookshelf here, The King's Pilgrimage, 1922, was going to be used, the sale of that book, to help pilgrims to come to these battlefields. So he wanted the families to be able to get here, and he knew that a lot of them would need help, so the sale of this book helped them to come here, to come and see the graves for themselves.
You say that word pilgrimage, Pete, and it's a chapter that I think is a fascinating story. If you're someone that's interested in the First World War, do more than just study the battles. Learn about the pilgrims that came over, because there's some absolutely fascinating aspects. And I find it an incredible aspect to think of those British families in the main coming over to visit their lost sons, and how they must have felt when they walked along those rows. We feel it today when we're going, we want to look up the name of someone from our local town, or someone who won the Victoria Cross, so we'll walk the rows. Here he is over here. Imagine you were doing that, but it was for your son. Imagine seeing your family name and the name of your son on that headstone, and it just must have been shattering, just heartbreaking for those families. And the story of those pilgrims and the pilgrimages is just fascinating. And if you can get now copies of the old Michelin guides, to the battlefields, which talk about how to basically explore the battlefields in an old Model T Ford or the equivalent in the early 1920s. They're fascinating to read, whether it says, to get to Messines from Ypres, you'll have to walk most of the way because the road is still shell blasted, even 5 or 6 years after the war. And it's just a really fascinating chapter. And the fact that the king would do something as unregal as scramble up to the top of the pillbox to look out over the views. It's just, we've got these wonderful connections with history. I love the stories of the pilgrims in the post-war years.
Yeah, I think what's amazing, those books you just mentioned on, the guidebooks to the Western Front, and there was a multitude of them produced, all came out in the very early 1920s. So you have to think, well, if these are coming out in the 1920s, when were they writing them? Well, literally, as the Germans were forced back in that final phase of the war, the 100 days, which will take the Germans out of the war and cause the armistice to be signed, then there were literally roving reporters following up behind as soon as they could get on the battlefield, writing down what they thought was going to be a good thing to come and have a look at. Because these little books came out very, very quickly, and because they knew, they could feel it. You have to say, so there must have already been discussions that people were going to go. I suppose it was obvious with the number of dead and the fact that people could then travel again, and Britain is so close to where the battlefields were compared to Australia or Canada or America or New Zealand. And they knew that especially people from Britain were going to want to come and look, even those that hadn't lost people. They would want to come and look. And of course, we now know that a lot of the servicemen themselves, as they were discharged, came immediately back. And we know why PTSD, as we now call it. They needed to come back to the battlefields themselves. So in the 1920s, we have relatives, we have people that are just interested, and we have the veterans themselves, all intermingling on these battlefields.
You mentioned the people from far-flung countries, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, America. If we talk about the dominions of the British Empire and how far they had to travel, just bear that in mind. If you're one of those people who questions whether you're worthy of making this trip to walk the battlefields, whether you're worthy to stand in the shadows of these graves, bear that in mind, that the families who lost someone from Australia or New Zealand or Canada or South Africa or so many other places from around the world, they never would have made this trip in the main. Not only was it too expensive, but if you think about it, the only way to get there was by ship. It was probably 6 weeks each way on a ship. So you would have had to take a few months off work to come to the battlefields. If you're a working man or woman in the suburban suburbs of Sydney or Perth or Melbourne, who would have had the time or the money to take a 3-month trip to Europe in the early 1920s? So most of the families never got to see these graves in their lifetime. So when you come and you stand in front of the grave of a soldier, if you've come all the way from Australia or New Zealand or Canada or South Africa, you're completing this pilgrimage the family never did. And so you absolutely are worthy to stand in these spots, and it's a wonderful, a wonderful thing you're doing, and you deserve, a big thank you for making that effort, because you are making that connection with history that the families never got to themselves. So I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but I always feel that when you take Australians to these graves, when you take New Zealanders, that they are paying an immense respect to these men who unfortunately their families never got the opportunity to do that.
It's always fascinating when I'm on a tour coach to get a breakdown of why the people are here. And there are always people who are directly relatives of soldiers that were lost here, and in very many cases they are the first relatives to visit. Then there are people who have relatives who fought but didn't die. And then there are people who have no connection. There may be recent arrivals from other countries to Australia or Canada, and no real connection to the Great War. And they are here because they want to learn about it and understand. And so you get this mix of people and why they come to the battlefields. And it doesn't really matter. And I think that's the most important thing, so long as we come. I mean, for all these guys that are lying in this enormous cemetery, the worst aspect would be if nobody came. If the gates were just closed and nobody bothered to come, that would be the worst outcome, I think, of the creation of these cemeteries, because they are beautiful. And we haven't mentioned what we're looking at as well. In the summer when you come here, the number of roses here, it's just extraordinary. It is a beautiful, beautiful place. And it was intended to be. Now, these were supposed to look like English gardens. And I use that term English because that is what they wanted. And I have in the past said, why isn't it like an Australian garden? Well, an Australian garden wouldn't grow particularly well in northern France. But an English garden will. And so that's what the plan was, that these places would be beautiful and would feel beautiful. And because Tyne Cot is so big, and it has areas that denote where, so you can find a soldier, obviously there is a map, there is a plan, and to aid you with that, we have wider gaps within the graves, and they've used those wider gaps to plant larger plants, which is unusual. You don't see large plants in the cemeteries very often. Makes it even more beautiful. It is a beautiful place to come to.
Well, let's enjoy the beauty even more, Pete. Where are we heading to next after we've left the Cross of Sacrifice and the blockhouse?
Well, we're going to carry on walking down the central path. There's a footpath right up through the middle. Now, again, we get worse sometimes here, but they've done something very clever. They use a plastic mesh that actually stops the soil from being compressed so badly, because they get so many thousands and thousands of people weekly, that daily in some cases, that it means the ground compresses and the grass dies. So we get this. It's not very noticeable, but it helps. We're going to walk down through the centre towards what would be the entrance, the old entrance. And we're going to go and have a look at two graves that I always take people to. And these are two soldiers that were awarded the Victoria Cross. There are actually three soldiers buried within the cemetery who were awarded the Victoria Cross. But I have to say, predominantly, I tend to take Australians. We have one Canadian and two Australians buried here. We've already mentioned one of them, Sergeant Lewis McGee of the 40th Battalion. He's very relevant to here because, of course, this is where he fought. We can see we can't quite see the blockhouse. It's in a little farm complex below us to the right-hand side. Interestingly, it's a place I've always wanted to go to, but it's got one of the world's grumpiest farmers who owns it. And every time you try to go and sneak in to go and have a look at the blockhouse that McGee actually took, then you get shooed off in a rather unceremoniously.
I'm exactly the same, Pete. It's exactly the same for me. It's the one spot on the battlefields I've never managed to get to is Hamburg Farm. So one day we will. We should buy him a gift or something, but we will crack that one day and get a look at Lewis McGee's pillbox.
Yeah, because it is there, and it's an interesting comment, isn't it? Why on earth would you build a farm complex around the pillbox? Well, it's actually the other way around. The pillbox was built in the middle of a farm complex to camouflage it. The farm is then blown away in the fighting. The farmer comes back in the 1920s, and you can imagine coming back and saying, "Well, that's where my farm was. Yes, it's gone. I expected that, but what's it meant to do with this damn great blockhouse that's here?" And so they built the farms around the blockhouses. So when you look at this landscape, it's not obvious how many blockhouses still survive. A lot of them are within farm complexes. They use them for keeping things in. They use them for growing mushrooms in or whatever, but they're there. And we know for a fact that the McGee's blockhouse is still there within that complex. But yeah, one day we'll get there.
McGee was actually killed in the field, if you're standing facing the front of the cemetery, he was killed in the field to the right, an area known as Augustus Wood, although there was no wood there at all. Just that terrible slog towards the village of Passchendaele. Just the fields all around Tyne Cot are absolute killing fields from the Battle of Passchendaele, and that field. So again, if you're standing in the cemetery facing the entrance, the field immediately to your right, was where the site of Augustus Wood, and that was where the Australians got so bogged down during that advance towards Passchendaele. They didn't get much further than that field on the right, and sadly there Lewis McGee was killed along with hundreds and hundreds of his comrades, most of whom are now buried in Tyne Cot Cemetery.
Yep. And then if we go further to the left towards the blockhouse that's on the left-hand side, then we come across a grave again, which is interesting because it ties in nicely with what we've just been talking about, and that is a visit to the to look for your relative, or to go and see the grave of your relative. And this is the grave of Captain Clarence Smith Jeffries, should I say, of the 34th Battalion. And he was mortally wounded and died during the attack on the 12th, I think. And he actually died on that day and was awarded the Victoria Cross for the fighting on that day. His mortal wound was well reported. It's rather gruesome. He was shot in the stomach and it took him some time to die. He was then buried by another battalion and his grave was marked, but it was lost. Like so many, it was lost. Interestingly, both of the guys we're talking about would be unaware that they were going to be awarded the Victoria Cross. They both died, one posthumously, one a few days after, so neither of them would be aware that they would eventually be awarded the Victoria Cross. Clarence Smith Jeffries was lost, and he was not actually found until 1921. And his father had actually made that long journey from Australia. They were from Newcastle. They were a wealthy family, obviously. And his father had made that journey. He'd come to the Western Front to help look for his son. He was affected to such a degree. He felt it was the only thing he could do. And a very lucky situation that he was wealthy enough to be able to come. And he was there looking, and the body was not found. Now, I have heard it said that he was on the way back to Australia when the body was found. I've just been looking at the dates and times. It doesn't work. I suspect that he was already back in Australia when his body was found. And so he had to come again. He felt it was necessary, and he made the pilgrimage again to visit his son's grave. One of the things I should say, we are getting more information from the Commonwealth war graves all the time. And one of the things that they are allowing us, they've always had these things in the records. They didn't feel it was the right thing to do to open up these records until perhaps most of the people themselves, the survivors, have now gone. There's nobody left from the Great War, and so we have information concerning how they were identified, what they was found on their bodies, where they were exhumed from originally, and we know that he was identified by his captain's pips, some Australian numerals on his uniform, and his initials on the ground sheet, and that's why how he was identified in 1921 when his body was found.
Just about every time I've been to Tyne Cot and eavesdropped on a group there, you'll hear someone say that Jeffries was killed capturing the pillbox that he's now buried in front of. That's not the case. He was killed a little bit further over at a place called Tyne Cot, which is over on the railway line. To your left as you stand looking towards the front of the cemetery. And it's a fascinating story. He led charges on several pillboxes and captured them and killed the crews, and then he charged a final German position, and the Germans swung the machine gun around and killed him, but his men completed the capture. Also, just incidentally, if you are in Sydney, we've mentioned before the wonderful museum put together by Brad Manera at the Hyde Park Memorial, at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park in the middle of Sydney. If you go in there, there's a wonderful, it's not a diorama, but it's a similar thing. It's a model showing the attack of Jeffries on these pillboxes on the Passchendaele Ridge. And so that's what's depicted in this wonderful model as the centerpiece of this museum at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park. So definitely go and check that out if you're in Sydney. It's an amazing story. Clarence Jeffries is an amazing story, and he went to Dudley High School, and he and another of his classmates were awarded the Victoria Cross during the First World War, which is astonishing. Two blokes from the same class, from a tiny little corner of Newcastle. So a great story, Clarence Jeffries. And interesting, his name, people think his last name was Smith Jeffries as if it was hyphenated. It wasn't. It was the Smith is his middle name, the common...
It's a good middle name. It's a good middle name.
It's interesting, Pete. It's kind of fallen out of favour a little bit, this idea it's particularly prominent during the First World War because you see it on so many headstones, but the idea that the oldest son would take his mother's maiden name as his middle name. So that's why you often see some quite unusual middle names, like Smith is an unusual middle name. You'll see Mackenzie and MacDonald and Fraser, and you see all of these unusual, but that was the common practice, which has fallen out of favour of the oldest son would have his mother's maiden name, which is actually a really nice family connection that I think we should bring back in. But let's talk about the pillboxes. We're standing now right in front of these pillboxes. Let's talk about them.
I'm just going to go back just slightly, as I often
Please do.
Just talking about that diorama that you were talking about that was created with the help of Brad Manera. I actually was involved in that because, bizarrely as it may seem, they wanted to get the colour right of the colour of the mud. And so I was asked to go and look at some Flanders mud and to try and identify the colour and then send a kind of a swatch back so that they could ensure that the mud was painted in the right shade of the to make it a realistic depiction of the landscape. So if you go and have a look at it, then that colour was chosen by myself.
Pete, it never ceases to amaze me the extent that you are involved in remembrance, particularly for Australians. It's a wonderful gift. I mean, your partner is Australian, your children are half Australian. It's a wonderful gift that you give to Australia. Your involvement in this, so thank you for that on behalf of all Australians. So when you go and observe the mud, and you note if you've been to Tyne Cot, you go, "Geez, they did well with the colour of that mud."
It's great.
Or mud, we'd probably pronounce it.
Mud,
isn't it?
we would.
Mud, yeah, the colour of the mud. You can thank Pete Smith. But let's talk about it's actually a good segue to talk about the mud and the trenches and the pillboxes. I mean, the mud was the reason that there are so many pillboxes in this part of the battlefield. Let's talk about them.
Well, when you look at this pillbox that's directly in front of us now, it always seems odd because you think, how did they get into it to start off with? There's no door. There should be a door at the back, and we are at the back of it. There's nothing obviously there. But if you look carefully, you can see the top of some concrete slabs, and those slabs are covering over the doorway. So what that tells you immediately is that the doorway is low down, and so we entered by a very shallow trench. The entrance to these pillboxes is normally a kneeler door. So this is not full-size doors. You got into them with a smaller entrance as you could easily get into without actually really crawling. And that's because the larger the aperture, the larger the opening, then the more chance of a piece of steel getting inside there. So you wanted a small opening. There's actually two. So there's two openings, which also tells you, why would you have two openings? Well, it's because it's in two sections. This pillbox has a wall in a middle section, so it's actually two separate compartments. And again, for that reason, that if a fragment of steel or a shell got inside it and it detonated, because it's in two sections, it means that not everybody would be killed, just the one side that was destroyed. So it's one blockhouse, but two segments inside. If you then walk round to the front, because the back is it looks okay. The concrete's fairly flush, and I should say, we have talked about concrete previously in these podcasts. This is good quality concrete. Gives you
we both get pretty excited when we talk about concrete and pillboxes. I know.
Yeah,
the nerd comes out in us.
Good quality concrete. It means it was made behind the lines far enough that they could bring up commercial mixers for mixing this. So very well made concrete. We walked round to the front, which was facing the enemy, in this case Australians, and it's pockmarked all over. So we can immediately see again what side was taking the damage. There are also fire apertures here. So this is not just as some of the earlier pillboxes would be, and very common to find just shelters. So they are just shelters. This was not a shelter. If you wanted to, you could fight from within it. Now, I have to say, in most cases, the Germans did not. They brought their guns out as we got closer and closer, we being the Australians in this case, and they set their guns up beside the pillboxes. They very rarely fought from within them. They didn't like it, and I can understand why completely. You like that bit more of a freedom behind your sandbag walls because, of course, the shelling stops when the infantry gets close. So you're not going to be so heavily shelled, and it means that you have more chance of catching your enemy with the guns when you can swing it round quickly. So, but we do have fire apertures at the front here, fairly fixed. They didn't have a lot of sway, and we can see by the angle that it was very long range. This would have been firing almost at the maximum. So these guns were originally used for long range firing. When the infantry got closer, you took your gun outside and you fought outside. Very often, the people that went inside then would be command or medical that would take over the inside of the blockhouse. And so these were heavily fought over, but they're great examples. I think it's a shame we can't actually go inside them, but I can see why we can't, because here it's so waterlogged. Almost certainly they're full of, or half full of water, the lower areas, so it wouldn't be suitable. But it's a shame because there are an awful lot of them about, but very few that we can actually get inside.
We should mention as well, these were named by British and Australian troops in the area. One is called, the two pillboxes at the front of the cemetery, one is called Irksome and the other is called the Barnacle, which describes, I think, pretty specifically how difficult they were to capture. Just really good examples, again, of these frontline positions. Fighting in the mud. The fighting here was not very solid fixed trenches, as we would have seen on the Somme. The fighting here was, the Germans were employing what was called defence in depth, where pillboxes would be mutually supporting. And Pete, I read a statistic, this may be wrong, but the statistic I read was that the Australians captured the first two pillboxes at the front of the cemetery early on in the attack, but it took them several days to take the other pillboxes, which now occupy the cemetery as well, because there's two more at the back of the cemetery too that are covered up. But that it actually took them several days to complete the capture of the area, which is now known as Tyne Cot Cemetery. But I'm just trying to imagine being occupying the area around one of those pillboxes at the front, and literally only 100 metres away, the area is still occupied by German machine gun crews. It's not surprising that so many people were killed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I find it quite horrific, actually. Pillbox fighting, I would much rather be outside than inside. But that's a choice you have. When the enemy gets closer, you can fight from the outside or you can fight from the inside. And of course, if you've made that decision to fight from the inside and you've shut the steel doors and you've barricaded them and you've just got apertures and you've got machine guns poking out of these, they are flipping difficult to take, because you've got to get right up to them and somehow you've got to get a grenade or something inside. And if you've got a garrison that is mutually supportive, so you've got another pillbox covering the front of that one and it can fire across the front and they can protect each other, it's difficult to get close to them to actually get into them. So again, it's down to the quality of the men in a lot of cases. If they're willing to fight it out and hope that somebody else will come and relieve them and help them, or the enemy will fall back, then they are willing to fight on. Always a choice you have: fight on or surrender or die, really. And we get a great range of things happening. Sometimes the bunkers fell very, very easily, very quickly. Other times they fought it on and until eventually they're all killed, or in fact we fail to take it and we have to fall back.
We've talked about a lot of things in this podcast series, Pete, relating to the horrors of the First World War, and all of them are horrific. The nature of everything that we describe is just horrific. But I don't think anything is more horrific than the idea of being a machine gun crew inside a concrete pillbox as you are surrounded by the enemy, especially after you've just killed dozens of their comrades. They are not going to treat you well, and the horrific nature of the pillbox fighting in general for both sides, but very, very few prisoners were ever taken from those pillboxes. There was something seen as incredibly unsporting to machine gun dozens of men from the safety of concrete, and then as soon as you realised the game was up, to throw your arms up in the air and try to be taken prisoner. The very few of these German machine gun crews were taken prisoner. Just absolutely horrific.
Yeah, I mean, we get some horrific accounts, and perhaps the one that we've spoken about it in a previous podcast when we did Polygon Wood, but the fighting at Scott's Post at the blockhouse there was particularly horrific.
Where to next, Pete, after we've examined the pillboxes? I mean, they're both very impressive. They've got tall trees around them. You can see them from miles around. You can see they're right on the top of the ridge. It gives you an astonishing perspective. You don't feel like you're on top of a ridge when you stand at Tyne Cot until you look out on the view and see how the ground slopes down. And they're very, very well placed, these pillboxes, to just cover the entire ridgetop.
And I think that's the key to the cemetery. The cemetery equally was very well placed, and you often wonder what was the architect looking for. It's Sir Herbert Baker, who is the architect here, or the main architect, and he was looking for symmetry to start off with, and that symmetry he found in the pillboxes, in these three that we can now see or know where they are. As you mentioned, there are others, but we can no longer see them. They are buried beneath some of the buildings here, especially at the back. So it's we're going to walk towards the entrance, what would be the entrance, and just have a chat about something that we haven't mentioned before. How on earth do you find somebody in this cemetery? If you are looking for somebody, how do you find them? Well, they have registers. They have a register of everybody that's buried in this cemetery. And so from that register and it's alphabetical for everybody that's buried here, whichever nationality within the Commonwealth you are. There's also a map, a plan, so we can actually find them, a reference with each name, and we can actually find them. It's not easy. It's such a big cemetery that I always have to have if I know that I have relatives or people that are interested in the grave, I always have to have a pre-look, because it's difficult to, not easy, because it's such a large cemetery, to find them immediately. It's good practice, actually, to have a go at finding the soldiers buried within a cemetery. Start with a smaller one. It's easier with a smaller one. It's not so confronting, because it is confronting, and that's the thing that's interesting here, because this is the old entrance. This is the way that, if you want to, you can walk down the side. Something we haven't mentioned, I think we've mentioned it in previous podcasts, but there is a visitor centre here. And it isn't one of my favourites. There are others, and I think I'm not sure it's necessary. We have museums all over. We can go. Do we need a visitor centre for a cemetery? Perhaps for those that know nothing, then it is helpful. But I think for a lot of people who've done a little bit of reading, and there's an awful lot written about Tyne Cot Cemetery, it's not necessary to loiter along in the visitor centre here. But if you come via the visitor centre, then it brings you down the side of the wall, and you come through the traditional entrance at the front here, and that's where we're standing now, looking at the register and looking back up towards the blockhouse, and it gives us another perspective. It's a perspective looking at the cemetery above us or on the sloping ground in front of us.
It's just an extraordinary place, Pete. I mean, that interpretive centre that's there, I suppose it's a good thing. It was one of the ones that I probably saw as an example of potentially, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but is it necessary to have an interpretive centre there? But the centrepiece, which I thought was a little bit ironic, is that they have a display case showing, well, I think it's beneath the floor, but showing artefacts from the First World War that were discovered, but they were discovered during the construction of the interpretive centre. So there's kind of a circular loop there of thoughts about why they're on display. But it's and they have a commentary. They show pictures, they project pictures on the walls of soldiers buried in the cemetery, and they have their names and ages. So it can be quite moving to look at that interpretive centre. But one of the things about interpretive centres, and we mentioned this a few weeks ago, and we talked about it, that I have a slight issue with, is it can potentially change the way the cemetery is used from the original design. And probably the best example of that is Lysenhoek Cemetery, again, also in the Ypres Salient, the second largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the world. And it was the largest at the end of the First World War because it was constructed during the war. An incredible cemetery. And unusually, when you approach Lysenhoek, the entrance is sort of in the bottom left corner. It's not in the centre like it is at Tyne Cot. And when you go to that cemetery, it always seems very weird that you have to walk all the way along the front. And obviously in the old days, you used to just park on the road out the front, but the entrance is sort of in the bottom left corner. And I believe that was because Lysenhoek Cemetery, because it was a hospital cemetery and created during the war, the headstones are very close together compared to Tyne Cot. And when you come through that door, I believe the original intention was to force you to look diagonally across the cemetery and just to get this incredible perspective. Tyne Cot is so well laid out that you don't quite get that perspective of just how many headstones you're looking at. But when you go to Lysenhoek, because they're so crammed together, you have this incredible perspective when you come through the front entrance of just looking diagonally across the cemetery at all these thousands and thousands. I think it's close to 10,000 headstones. They built an interpretive centre several years ago at Lysenhoek at the side, and they built a car park. And so what they did was they put a little gate in at the side as well, so you could come straight from the interpretive centre into the cemetery. And to me, that changed the entire perspective. And to me, you lost that effect that the original architects had. Interestingly, last time I was there, that gate was closed and locked, and they were encouraging you to walk back around the front. So maybe they realised the error of their ways. But it is one of the things that I have a slight issue with when we do these new things. Is it does change the way these cemeteries and memorials were originally intended to be used.
I'm not going to say anything. Now, the reason I'm not going to say anything is because I'd like to do a podcast on Lysenhoek at some stage in the future, and there's a very good reason why we walk around the front now. But I won't spoil it because I think it's a good story to tell, and there's a whole story we can do on that cemetery. But it's a fascinating cemetery, and it is interesting that we have to walk so far. The same as Tyne Cot to a certain extent, to get in the original entrance, because there is no parking anywhere near the original entrance.
That was a wonderful little tangent from me. It's wonderful. It's like a journey on the battlefield. You could wander off in all sorts of directions during this podcast. Yeah. Back to Tyne Cot. What else? We've mostly completed the tour now. What else? Is there anything else you wanted to point out?
No, I think we're there. I was going to mention the architect that designed some of the sculptures there, F.V. Blunstone. So he was the sculptor, because it's the sculptures. You have to look careful, but on top of what would you call those buildings? The buildings at each side of the wall memorial to the missing, the big wall at the back. We have angels on the top, and you can miss them. You can just look at them and think, oh, that's a sculpture. But you need to kind of have, like all of these cemeteries, they were very carefully thought through, and you do have to look carefully. And that's why it's a good thing to spend some time, not be like some of the people that visit, off the coach, round the cemetery, cross the sacrifice, up to the top, take your picture, back on the coach. You need to contemplate and to think and to look, because there is so much to look at. And as I said, 2 hours here can go past in a flash when you're wandering amongst these graves.
When we were talking about this just before we started recording, Pete, you also mentioned a wonderful little tidbit of information that neither of us knew about the inauguration of the cemetery. Tell us that one, because what a wonderful little point to end on.
It is. I just presumed, and I have done for years, that the cemetery, because the king was here in his pilgrimage, that perhaps that was the inauguration of the cemetery. But in just quickly scribbling some notes down and looking a little bit online, I discovered that the cemetery was actually officially inaugurated on the 20th of June in 1927 by Sir Gilbert Dyett. I think that's how you pronounce his name, who is an Australian. And he was the Dominion President of the British Empire Services League from 1921 to 1946. He'd also been the President of the RSL, the Returned Soldiers and Sailors and Airmen, eventually Imperial League in Australia as well. And so that's why he obviously got the job of inaugurating the cemetery in 1927. So I was quite pleased to find that. I now need to find out what he did in the First World War. I haven't looked yet. That's going to be a little job in the next few days to see. I know he served on the Gallipoli Peninsula, but what did he do after that? And what rank was he? I have no idea what rank he was, so I'm sure somebody will know all about him.
A good little detective hunt for you there, Pete. Again, just the wonderful little tidbits of information you can find while walking the battlefields. And isn't it remarkable that we've spent over an hour talking about one cemetery? This just shows people who haven't had the privilege of walking the ground of the Western Front, or indeed any famous battlefield, perhaps don't quite understand just how much information these sites convey, what a strong connection with the history there is. And I think this demonstrates that we've spent more time talking about it than many people will actually spend in the cemetery when they're there. It's just a remarkable, remarkable place. And I love these little journeys we do to a specific site, Pete. It's always great to get out and do a walk where we're walking across the battlefields, but doing a deep dive on some of these iconic sites are just remarkable. So I'm looking forward to doing more of them. Mate, as always, it's been extraordinary. I've learnt so much that I didn't know an hour ago about this wonderful place. So thank you very much for joining us to talk about it.
And I reiterate to people, try and go early in the morning or late in the evening as the sun's rising or setting. It's fantastic.
Well said, Pete, and we'll see everyone next week. As always, if you're enjoying the podcast, please go and give us a review, particularly on Apple Podcasts. That's what works best for helping people to find what we're doing here. But it's wonderful to have you walking the battlefields with us. And Pete, it's always wonderful to talk to you about it.
Pleasure. It's been great.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/ACAST and use code ACAST at checkout.
Your dining room is the heart of your home, where meals are shared and memories are made. At Ashley, you'll find affordable dining furniture in a range of classic and modern styles. Ashley small space sets and extendable tables are designed to fit beautifully into any space, from cozy breakfast nooks and kitchens to formal dining areas fit for a feast. And with mix and match seating options, everyone at your table gets the perfect seat. At Ashley, style is served. Shop in-store or online today.